So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Sign the papers, Julian, Beatrice Sterling snapped, her voice cutting through the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor like a serrated blade. She stood at the foot of the hospital bed, her charcoal gray designer suit as sharp and unforgiving as her expression. Behind her, the private suite of the Sterling Memorial Wing smelled of cloying white lilies and the sharp, underlying sting of antiseptic. It was a room designed for dignity, yet Beatrice had filled it with the stench of a hostile takeover. Julian Thorne didn't look at the document she had thrust onto the bedside table. Instead, he looked at his uncle, the man who had built Sterling Global from a garage startup into a titan of the industry. Arthur Sterling lay motionless, his breathing assisted by a mechanical hiss that seemed to mock the silence in the room. "My uncle is still breathing, Beatrice," Julian said, his voice low and steady. "This is hardly the time for a legal ambush." "This isn't an ambush, it's a cleanup," Marcus Sterling chimed in, stepping forward from the shadows near the window. He checked his heavy gold watch, the metal glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You've been a charity case in the operations department for 10 years, Julian. We're just making it official. Sign the waiver, relinquish your minor interest in the core patents, and we'll ensure you have a very comfortable severance. Try to fight us, and you'll leave with nothing but the frayed suit on your back." Marcus leaned in, invading Julian's personal space. He smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. With a sneer, he flicked the collar of Julian's jacket. "Actually, I've seen better fabric on a bus seat. It's embarrassing to have you sitting here in front of the director." Director Harrison, the chairman of the board, stood near the door, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. Beside him, Sarah Jenkins, the head of archives, held a leather-bound ledger close to her chest, her knuckles white. They were the witnesses Beatrice had handpicked to ensure this transition looked legitimate. "Julian, please," Beatrice said, her tone shifting to a mock-sympathetic lilt that made his skin crawl. "Your father was a dreamer, and he died with nothing because he didn't understand how the world works. Don't make the same mistake. You're an operations clerk. You don't have the breeding or the vision to hold onto these assets. Sign the papers so we can save the company before the news of Arthur's condition hits the market." She held out a silver fountain pen. It felt heavy and cold as she pressed it into Julian's hand. Julian looked down at the pen, then at the document. He saw the patent numbers listed in the fine print, the proprietary code for the Aegis system, the very backbone of Sterling Global's infrastructure. Beatrice and Marcus believed these patents were part of the family estate they had spent the last decade systematically stripping from Julian's reach. They didn't realize that the code they were looking at was the 1994 legacy version. They had no idea that Julian had spent his clerk years quietly rebuilding the architecture from the ground up, filing the new iterations under a private shell company they didn't even know existed. "You really think I'm just a charity case?" Julian asked, his thumb grazing the small, encrypted key fob hidden in his pocket. It was a cold, jagged piece of metal that represented the true power in the building. "I think you're a footnote," Beatrice said, her patience finally snapping. She leaned over the bed, her shadow falling across her dying brother. "You're the son of a man who was too weak to lead, and you've inherited every bit of his insignificance. Now sign. I won't ask again." The room went silent, save for the rhythmic chirp hiss of the ventilator. Julian felt the weight of their gaze, Beatrice's predatory hunger, Marcus's smug entitlement, and the director's cold calculation. He looked at Sarah Jenkins. For a brief second, the archivist's eyes met his, and she gave a microscopic nod. She knew. She had seen the original 1994 filings. She knew exactly what Beatrice had stolen, and she knew what Julian had been doing in the basement archives for the last 3 years. Julian set the pen down on top of the unsigned papers. The sound of the metal hitting the table was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. "I won't be signing these," Julian said. Marcus laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You think you have a choice. We'll have you escorted out of the building by morning. Your keycards are already being deactivated." "Then I suppose there's no reason for me to stay," Julian replied. He stood up, smoothing the front of his cheap jacket. He looked at Beatrice, whose face was beginning to flush a dangerous mottled red. You've spent so much time looking down at me, Beatrice, that you've forgotten to look at what's right in front of you. Get out, she hissed. Leave, and don't bother coming to the board meeting on Tuesday. You're finished. Julian didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned and walked toward the door. As he passed Director Harrison, he paused for a fraction of a second. The board meeting is at 10, isn't it? Julian asked quietly. It is, Harrison replied, his brow furrowing in confusion. Good, Julian said, his voice gaining a sudden, razor-sharp edge. I'd hate to be late for my own company's reorganization. He walked out of the suite without looking back. As the heavy mahogany doors swung shut, he pulled his phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial contact. Sela's, it's Julian. They just tried to force the bedside waiver. It's time. Execute the Phoenix protocol and freeze the primary servers. If they want to play the legacy card, let's show them who actually owns the deck. Julian stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on the muffled sound of Beatrice's distant, angry shouting. The countdown had begun. He had 48 hours to dismantle a dynasty, and for the first time in 10 years, he was the one holding the pen. The following morning, the air in the Thorne Sterling archives felt heavy with the scent of aging parchment and industrial-grade ozone. Julian Thorne stood in the windowless room, his silhouette sharp against the glow of a single desk lamp. He wasn't supposed to be here. His security clearance had been flagged for termination at midnight, but the system's backdoors didn't recognize Beatrice's authority. To the servers, Julian was still the architect. Sarah Jenkins hurried toward him from the shadows of the high-density shelving, her footsteps echoing on the polished concrete. She clutched a weathered, leather-bound ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Her hands, mapped with the fine lines of 30 years of service, trembled slightly as she laid the book on the table. I found it, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. The 1994 acquisition records. Julian, I was there when your father signed the original partnership. This ledger contains the handwritten amendments Beatrice tried to incinerate after the funeral. Julian flipped to page 42. His fingers traced his father's bold, cursive signature. Just below it, a crude line of text had been added in a different, shakier hand, an amendment granting Beatrice full voting rights in the event of a medical incapacity. It was a blatant, amateurish addition. She didn't even match the ink, Julian murmured, the cold weight of a decade's worth of suspicion finally solidifying into a razor-sharp truth. He pulled a small, high-resolution scanner from his pocket. The device emitted a soft, rhythmic chime as it captured the evidence of the 30-year-old theft. Thank you, Sarah. You've done more for this company today than the board has done in 10 years. Just promise me you'll finish it, she said, her eyes searching his. She's already moving to erase you, Julian. 5 floors above, the atmosphere was far less quiet. Beatrice Sterling slammed her crystal espresso cup onto its saucer, the sharp clack echoing through her cavernous office. She glared at Marcus, who was slumped in a velvet armchair, frantically tapping at a tablet. What do you mean the server is locked? Beatrice demanded. Her voice was a low, dangerous hiss. She looked immaculate in a $4,000 charcoal suit, but the frantic pulse in her neck betrayed her. Marcus Sterling looked up, his face flushed with a mixture of sweat and indignation. The Phoenix protocol, Mom. I tried to override his credentials with the master key, but the system didn't just reject me, it laughed at me. A digital ghost appeared on the screen, a line of code that said ownership is 9/10 of the law. I can't even access the payroll files. That little rat, Beatrice spat. She paced to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city she believed she owned. He thinks he can hold my company hostage with a few lines of script. He's a glorified janitor with a laptop. He's the one who built the infrastructure, Mom, Marcus reminded her, his voice whining. The board is already asking why the morning reports are delayed. Director Harrison called twice. Beatrice turned, a predatory smile spreading across her face. She walked to her mahogany desk and pulled a blank sheet of official company letterhead from the drawer. If Julian Thorne wants to play the legacy card, we'll give him a legacy. Marcus, get the legal team on the phone. We're going to produce a backdated resignation and a full confession of trade secret theft. If he won't sign the waiver at his father's bedside, we'll simply find a version he already signed last week. Forgery! Marcus blinked, his eyes widening. That's a hell of a risk. It's only a risk if someone can prove it, she countered, her eyes cold as flint. And by the time the board meeting starts tomorrow at 10, Julian will be in a holding cell, and I'll be the sole signatory for the reorganization. He's a thorn. Nobody believes a thorn anymore. In a quiet corner of a darkened cafe 3 blocks away, Julian's phone vibrated. He tapped the screen, watching a live feed of Beatrice's office through a hidden camera he'd installed 3 years ago inside a smoke detector. He watched her pen hit the paper, watched the calculated malice in her expression as she began to forge his name. "Are you seeing this, Silas?" Julian asked into his earpiece. "Crystal clear," Silas Vance replied from the other end. The attorney's voice was smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. "She's handing us the rope to hang her with. I've already prepared the injunction. The moment she presents that document to Director Harrison, we trigger the server-wide reveal." Julian closed the ledger and tucked the scanner into his jacket. He looked at his watch. 24 hours remained until the board meeting. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and Beatrice Sterling was currently signing her own professional death warrant. "Let her write," Julian said, a grim, satisfied shadow of a smile touching his lips. "I want her to be very confident when she walks into that boardroom tomorrow. It'll make the fall so much more spectacular." 2 hours after Julian Thorne left the dim, dust-choked silence of the archives, he stood in a glass-walled office that overlooked the city's glowing arteries. The rhythmic tapping of a gold fountain pen against a mahogany desk was the only sound in the room. Silas Vance sat across from him, his sharp, predatory eyes fixed on the leather-bound ledger Julian had placed between them. The air in the office smelled of expensive espresso and the ozone of high-end air purifiers, a stark contrast to the scent of decay Julian had carried from the basement. Silas leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the yellowed pages of the 1994 ledger Sarah Jenkins had risked her career to provide. He didn't touch it yet. He treated the book like a live explosive. "This is it," the attorney whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The original incorporation signatures. Your father's handwriting is unmistakable, Julian. And the transfer of technology rights, it was never signed by him. It was a temporary licensing agreement that Beatrice Sterling's father, and then Beatrice herself, reinterpreted as a total surrender of ownership." Julian didn't smile. The satisfaction was there, but it was cold, coiled deep in his chest like a sleeping predator. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. "And this is the final nail. I caught her in the act tonight. High-definition footage of her forging my signature on the updated patent waivers. She thinks she's insulated herself. She thinks that by tomorrow morning, the board will see a document that proves I've handed over the last of my rights for a pittance." Silas finally let out a short, sharp laugh. He picked up the flash drive with the reverence of a man holding the keys to a kingdom. "She's not just arrogant, she's delusional. I've already drafted the injunctions. Director Harrison is expecting a routine briefing on the merger, but I've sent him a private message. He knows something is coming. He's a man of integrity, Julian. He won't stand for a fraud of this magnitude, especially not when the evidence is this visceral." "Good," Julian said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. He felt the weight of the original ledger, the deed to his father's stolen legacy, and the debt that had been accruing interest for nearly 30 years. "I want her to feel the floor drop away, not in private. I want her to be at the head of that table at the absolute peak of her perceived power when we pull the tether." The following morning, the atmosphere at Sterling Global was electric with a frantic, superficial energy. Julian had barely stepped off the elevator when the heavy, cloying scent of white lilies hit him. Beatrice had the entire executive floor decorated as if it were a coronation. "Thorne, move it." Marcus Sterling's voice barked from the hallway. The younger man was leaning against a marble pillar, checking his reflection in the polished surface of a digital directory. He was wearing a suit that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan, but his posture was slouching and sloppy. He looked Julian up and down with a sneer that didn't quite hide the insecurity beneath it. "My mother wants those final projection binders on the board table in 10 minutes, Marcus snapped, stepping into Julian's personal space. He reached out, flicking a piece of imaginary lint off Julian's shoulder with a condescending smirk. "Try to look at least semi-professional today, will you? It's a big day for people who actually matter. Once this merger is signed, we might finally find a corner of the warehouse for you to rot in permanently." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at Marcus, his gaze so calm it was unnerving. "I'll make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be, Marcus. You have my word." Marcus let out a derisive snort and turned on his heel, his expensive Italian loafers clicking loudly on the marble. Julian watched him go, then turned toward the CEO's suite. Inside, Beatrice Sterling was a vision of predatory elegance. She was draped in a cream-colored silk suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She was standing by the window, sipping champagne from a crystal flute despite it being barely 9 in the morning. When she saw Julian, she didn't turn around. She watched his reflection in the glass. "The forgery went well, I assume?" she asked, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying confidence. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. In her mind, Julian was already defeated. "The documents are being processed," Julian replied. Beatrice turned then, her eyes flashing with a cruel triumph. She walked toward him, the silk of her suit rustling like a snake in dry grass. She stopped inches from him, the smell of her perfume, something sharp and floral, filling the space between them. "You've been a useful little shadow, Julian. Truly. But after today, the Thorne name officially becomes a footnote in the Sterling history books. I've invited the entire senior staff to witness the signing. I want them to see what happens to people who think they can hold onto a past that doesn't belong to them." She reached out, patting his cheek with a hand that was ice cold. "Don't look so grim. You're lucky to even be in the room. Most people in your position would be watching from the sidewalk." Julian felt the hard edge of the flash drive in his pocket, a secret power that felt like a heartbeat. He looked into her eyes that saw him as nothing more than a ghost, and felt a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Beatrice," he said. "I think the board is going to find the presentation unforgettable." She laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that held no warmth. "I'm sure they will. Now get out. I have a legacy to finalize." Julian exited the office, his pace measured and deliberate. He walked past the rows of assistants, past the frantic enablers, and past Director Harrison, who was just entering the building with a look of grim curiosity. He looked at his watch. 2 hours. In 2 hours, the board would convene. In 2 hours, the lilies would start to smell like a funeral. Julian Thorne reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the silver drive one last time. The countdown had reached its final stretch, and for the first time in 30 years, the debt was about to be collected in full. 90 minutes remained. The air in the executive lounge of Sterling Global felt thick, heavy with the scent of expensive espresso, and the ozone of a gathering storm pressing against the glass. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray clouds swallow the city skyline. He felt the cold, hard weight of the silver drive in his pocket, a small object that held the power to dismantle a 30-year lie. "Still lingering, Julian." He didn't need to turn to recognize the voice. Marcus Sterling stepped into his peripheral vision, adjusting the cuffs of a suit that cost more than Julian's first 3 years of salary combined. Marcus smelled of an aggressive, citrus-heavy cologne that felt like a physical intrusion. He leaned against the mahogany sideboard, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked Julian up and down with practiced disdain. "I'm surprised you haven't packed your cardboard box yet," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to carry to the two assistants hovering near the elevator. "My mother was quite clear. After today's vote, there won't be a desk left for you in this building, or any building with the Sterling name on it." Julian turned slowly, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. "The vote hasn't happened yet, Marcus. A lot can change in an hour." Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Change. The board is in my mother's pocket. Director Harrison is already signing the paperwork for the merger. You're a ghost, Thorne, a relic of a father who didn't know how to play the game." He stepped closer, invading Julian's personal space, his eyes narrowing. "Do yourself a favor. Walk out now. Save yourself the humiliation of being escorted out by security in front of the cameras." Julian didn't flinch. He simply reached out and straightened Marcus's silk tie, a gesture so calm it made the younger man freeze in confusion. "You should focus on your own presentation, Marcus. Arrogance is a poor substitute for accuracy." Before Marcus could snap back, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. Beatrice Sterling emerged, flanked by two lawyers and a cloud of floral perfume that seemed to choke the hallway's oxygen. She looked radiant in a sharp, cream-colored power suit, her pearls glowing against her throat like trophies. She didn't even look at Julian as she approached her son. "Marcus, stop playing with the help," Beatrice said, her tone as cold as the marble floors. She finally cut her eyes toward Julian, her gaze flicking over his modest charcoal suit with visible revulsion. "I told you to leave, Julian. Your presence is an eyesore on a day this historic." "I thought you might want a final warning, Beatrice," Julian said, his voice steady and low. "The 1994 archives were moved this morning. You might find the current records incomplete." Beatrice paused, her hand hovering over the gold handle of her briefcase. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, crossed her face. Then she smoothed her expression into a mask of regal indifference. She let out a soft, melodic laugh that held no humor. "Warnings from a man who has nothing are merely empty threats," she sneered, stepping so close Julian could see the fine lines of tension around her eyes. "I built this empire while you were hiding in a lab. I own the patents, I own the board, and by the end of the hour I will own the Sterling legacy entirely. What could someone like you possibly do to stop me?" "I'm not trying to stop you, Beatrice," Julian replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm just making sure you're there to see the debt collected." She rolled her eyes, turning her back on him with a dismissive wave of her hand. "He's lost his mind, Marcus. Let's go. Director Harrison is waiting." As they swept toward the boardroom, Silas Vance appeared from the stairwell. He didn't speak, but as he passed Julian, his fingers brushed against Julian's arm and he offered a single, imperceptible nod. The legal trap was set. Julian watched them enter the lion's den, the heavy doors thudding shut behind them with a sound of finality. He pulled the silver drive from his pocket, the metal cool against his palm. He had dropped the hint, and as expected, her ego had blinded her to the cliff edge. He checked his watch. 60 minutes. The lilies in the lobby were starting to smell like a funeral after all. 6 hours had passed since the boardroom doors had thudded shut, sealing the fate of the Sterling legacy behind mahogany and silence. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel had been transformed into a cathedral of glass and light, smelling of forced elegance and white gardenias. This was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, the night Beatrice Sterling used every year to remind the city's elite exactly who held the scepter. She stood at the center of the room, a vision in emerald silk that shimmered like a serpent's scales under the crystal chandeliers. Her laughter was melodic, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth as she held court with a cluster of investors. Beside her, Marcus Sterling adjusted his tuxedo jacket with the nervous twitch of a man wearing a costume he hadn't earned. He looked every bit the heir apparent, provided no one looked too closely at the hollow desperation in his eyes. Julian Thorne entered the ballroom through the main archway, and for a moment, the rhythmic clink of crystal against silver seemed to falter. He wasn't wearing his usual charcoal work suit. He had chosen a midnight blue tuxedo, tailored with a precision that suggested a level of wealth he had never publicly claimed. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his presence a stark contrast to the frantic social climbing happening around him. "Look at this," Marcus sneered, his voice cutting through the ambient swell of the cello quartet as he spotted his cousin. He stepped forward, blocking the path toward the bar. "Did you rent that, Julian? Or did you finally dip into the petty cash you've been counting for us all these years?" Julian didn't break his stride. He stopped inches from Marcus, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "The fit is better than yours, Marcus, though I suppose it's easier to fit a suit when you have a backbone to hang it on." Marcus's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, but his mother was suddenly there, her hand resting on his arm with the weight of a silk-covered shackle. Beatrice looked Julian up and down, her lip curling in a way that made her diamond necklace catch the light. "I'm surprised you showed your face here after the meeting this afternoon. Director Harrison was quite clear about the restructuring. There isn't much room for clerical staff at the top of the new Sterling hierarchy." "I'm not here for the hierarchy, Beatrice," he replied, his voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to carry further than her sharp tones. "I'm here for the history. History is for the dead," she snapped. "And you're looking remarkably like a ghost tonight. Why don't you find the catering entrance? I'm sure they need someone to help polish the silver. It's the only way you'll ever get to touch anything this valuable." A few of the surrounding guests chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Julian didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold, hard edge of the silver drive. The sensation was a tether to reality, a secret power humming against his palm. "Enjoy the gardenias," he said softly, looking her directly in the eye. "The scent is always strongest just before the petals fall." He turned away before she could respond, moving toward the far end of the ballroom where the Sterling Foundation's historical archives had been put on display. Sarah Jenkins stood by a velvet-lined case, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a display of original company ledgers from 1994. When she saw him, she offered a sharp, frantic nod. "Everything is loaded," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the massive projector screen positioned behind the main stage. "Sela's has the legal injunctions ready. If we do this, Julian, there is no going back. She will destroy you if you miss." "She can't destroy what she doesn't own," he said. He looked across the room and saw Sela's Vance standing near the tech booth, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. The attorney caught his eye and tapped his watch. 10 minutes. The tension in the room was a physical weight now, a coil winding tighter with every second. Julian watched as Director Harrison moved toward the stage, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. The chairman looked troubled, his gaze lingering on Julian for a heartbeat too long before he turned to Beatrice. Beatrice was in her element now. She climbed the 3 steps to the podium, the emerald silk of her gown trailing behind her like a spill of toxic waste. She tapped the microphone, and the room fell into a practiced, expectant silence. "Friends, colleagues, and partners," she began, her voice projected with a confidence that bordered on the divine. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the success of Sterling Global. We celebrate the future. A future built on the vision I have cultivated, a vision that leaves the stagnation of the past behind." Marcus stood at the foot of the stage, his chest puffed out, looking around the room to ensure everyone was watching his mother's triumph. He caught Julian's gaze and winked, a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Julian didn't look away. He leaned against a marble pillar, the shadow of it cutting across his face. He felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket, a single text from Sela's. "The feed is live." "To truly move forward," Beatrice continued, her hand reaching for a crystal flute of champagne, "we must acknowledge the foundation upon which we stand. Tonight, I am proud to announce a merger that will solidify the Sterling name for the next century." She raised her glass, the light refracting through the bubbles. "To the legacy we've built, and the one I intend to keep." The room began to lift their glasses in unison. Julian took a single step out of the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply raised his hand and signaled the tech booth. The massive screen behind Beatrice flickered. The celebratory logo of the Sterling Foundation vanished, replaced by a grainy, black-and-white scan of a handwritten contract dated June 12, 1994. The sound of the room changed instantly. The collective intake of breath was like a vacuum, sucking the air out of the ballroom. Beatrice hadn't turned around yet. She was still smiling, her glass held high, oblivious to the fact that the ghost of her greatest crime had just materialized 10 feet tall behind her head. Julian watched the color begin to drain from Marcus's face as he read the first line of the document on the screen. The enabler's glass began to shake, the ice rattling against the crystal with a frantic, rhythmic chime. "Beatrice!" Director Harrison's voice cracked through the silence, sounding older and more tired than Julian had ever heard it. "You might want to look behind you." Julian crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the back of his aunt's head. The countdown had hit 0. The debt was due. He waited for the moment she would turn, for the moment the Emerald Queen would realize her throne was made of glass, and he was the one holding the hammer. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical weight, pressing the air out of the grand ballroom. Beatrice Sterling finally turned, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor with a sound like a sharpening blade. She looked at the screen, then back at the sea of faces, her hand tightening around the stem of her crystal flute until her knuckles turned a ghostly, bloodless white. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice was thin and reedy, a far cry from the booming authority she had used to toast her own brilliance moments ago. She tried to force a laugh, a sharp, brittle sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. "Julian, is this some sort of juvenile prank? A projection error?" "It's not an error, Beatrice," Director Harrison said, his voice heavy with a sudden, sharp clarity. He stood up, his heavy chair scraping harshly against the parquet. He gestured to the screen, where Sarah Jenkins had highlighted the specific ledger entries from 1994, the original handwritten filings that proved the Sterling Foundation was built on a calculated theft from Julian's father. "These are the original records, the ones that were supposed to have been destroyed in the archive fire." Beatrice's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. The vibrant, youthful mask she had maintained for decades through sheer force of will and expensive serums seemed to lose its structural integrity. Her jaw slackened, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrolled twitch that made her look suddenly, jarringly old. The ruddy flush of triumph in her cheeks was replaced by a sallow, sickly gray, the color of wet ash. Her eyes, usually sharp and predatory, went wide and glassy, darting across the screen as if searching for a typo that wasn't there, while her chest hitched in shallow, frantic bursts that made the diamonds at her throat catch the projector's blue light in jagged, panicked flashes. Marcus Sterling let out a strangled sound, his glass slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the floor, spraying vintage champagne across the hem of his mother's dress, but she didn't even flinch. He looked like he wanted to bolt, his eyes darting toward the exit, but Silas Vance was already standing there, a leather briefcase tucked under his arm like a weapon and a grim smile on his face. Julian Thorne stepped forward, the cold glow of the projector casting long, sharp shadows across the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You spent 20 years telling me I was a charity case, Beatrice, a ghost in my father's house. You told every person in this room that I was lucky to even have a desk in the basement." He clicked a remote in his pocket. The screen changed. It wasn't just the old theft anymore. It was a current legal map of the company's core intellectual property, the algorithms that ran their entire global operation. Every single patent was registered to a holding company that Beatrice didn't recognize. "The tech that bears the Sterling name doesn't actually belong to the Sterling family," Julian said, his voice echoing in the dead-silent hall. "It belongs to me. I've spent the last 5 years buying back every piece of my father's legacy you sold off to fund Marcus's failures." The room erupted into a low, frantic hum of whispers. Sarah Jenkins stood near the back, her arms crossed, and her face a mask of quiet vindication as she watched the empire she'd been forced to help build start to crumble. The board members were already leaning away from Beatrice, their bodies physically distancing themselves from the woman they had championed only minutes before. "This is my company," Beatrice hissed, her voice finally returning, though it was jagged with desperation. She gripped the edge of the table, her manicured nails digging into the white linen. "I built this. You're nothing but a—" "You built a cage," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a cold, final register that cut through her screeching. "And you forgot who held the key." He turned his gaze to the entire room, his presence filling the space in a way it never had before. "The board meeting is moved to tomorrow morning at 8. My office, which, as of 20 minutes ago, is the one on the top floor." He didn't wait for her to scream. He didn't wait for Marcus to start begging. Julian turned on his heel and walked toward the double doors. The crowd parted for him like a retreating tide, the scent of expensive lilies and stale champagne following him out into the cool night air. Behind him, the Emerald Queen was finally alone on a throne that no longer existed. The double doors had barely clicked shut behind Julian before the vacuum of his departure was filled by Beatrice's scream. It was a raw, jagged sound that tore through the refined atmosphere of the ballroom, shattering the stunned silence of the elite guests. She lunged toward the head table, her fingers clawing at the documents Julian Thorne had left behind, as if physical destruction could erase the legal reality they represented. "It's a forgery!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a register that made the nearest board members flinch. "He's a thief, a disgruntled, pathetic little clerk trying to stage a coup." Beatrice's face underwent a violent metamorphosis. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of wet parchment, while her eyes bulged with a frantic, uncomprehending light. Her mouth hung open, the muscles in her neck corded and straining as she struggled to draw air, her breath coming in ragged, audible hitches that betrayed the absolute collapse of her composure. The mask of the poised CEO hadn't just slipped, it had shattered, leaving behind a hollowed-out expression of pure, unadulterated ruin. She looked older, suddenly, the illusion of the Emerald Queen dissolving into the reality of a woman whose stolen throne was turning to ash. Silas Vance stepped forward, his presence as cold and immovable as a tombstone. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it commanded the room. "The documents are original 1994 filings, Beatrice. They've been held in a blind trust and verified by 3 independent forensic auditors. Your signature on the transfer of intellectual property was never valid because the property was never yours to transfer. I built this." She roared, her hands shaking so violently that the champagne flute she'd been holding slipped from her grip. It hit the marble floor with a crystalline chime, the expensive vintage soaking into the hem of her designer gown. "You managed it," Director Harrison corrected, his voice heavy with a newfound disdain. He looked at her as if seeing a stranger for the first time. "But Julian owns it. The board has already received the digital copies of the trust's bylaws. We have a fiduciary duty to recognize the majority shareholder." Marcus Sterling, who had been standing frozen beside the bar, finally moved, but he didn't move toward his mother. He took a deliberate step back, his face pale and sweating. "I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Director Harrison, seeking any port in the storm. "I swear I had no idea about the 1994 filings. I was just following orders. She told me Julian was just an operations guy." Beatrice turned on her son, her expression twisting into a snarl of betrayal. "You coward," she hissed. "I did this for you. I secured your future." "You lied to the board, Mom," Marcus said, his voice gaining a pathetic sort of strength as he realized where the power had shifted. "If you committed fraud, that's on you. I'm just an employee." The guests began to move then, a collective, physical distancing. The circle around Beatrice widened until she stood in a literal island of isolation in the center of the ballroom. The scent of her expensive perfume, once a symbol of her dominance, now felt cloying and suffocating in the heat of the room. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the atmosphere in the top-floor boardroom was clinical, stripped of the previous night's gala theatrics. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner replaced the lilies and champagne. Beatrice was already there, her eyes rimmed with red, her suit slightly wrinkled as if she hadn't slept or changed. She sat at the head of the table, gripping a leather-bound folder like a shield. When the heavy mahogany doors swung open, the room went silent. Julian entered, followed by Silas and Sarah Jenkins. Sarah carried a blue archival box, the very one that contained the evidence Beatrice had tried to bury for decades. Julian didn't look at the other board members. He didn't look at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He walked directly to the head of the table. He stood there, silent, waiting for Beatrice to move. "You can't just walk in here," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former arrogance. "There are protocols, there is the law," Director Harrison interrupted, standing at the other end of the table. "Julian Thorne has provided the necessary documentation to the SEC and our legal counsel. The transition is effective immediately. Beatrice, you are requested to vacate the premises." "I am the CEO," she shouted, slamming her hand onto the table. "You were the occupant of a stolen chair," Julian said. His voice was calm, devoid of the rage she expected, which seemed to terrify her more than a scream ever could. "The security teams are already clearing your office. Your personal items will be couriered to your home by noon. Your access to company accounts was terminated at midnight." Beatrice looked around the table, searching for a single ally, a single enabler. Marcus sat at the far end, his head down, refusing to meet her gaze. The other directors looked away, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to active disgust. "You think you can do this?" she hissed, standing up so abruptly her chair skidded backward. "I will sue you into the ground. I will tell the press everything. I will ruin this company before I let you have it." "The press already has the 1994 filings, Beatrice," Julian replied, his eyes steady. "Sarah has ensured the archives are fully transparent. If you want to talk to the media, I suggest you start with the Financial Crimes Division." She opened her mouth to retort, but the words died in her throat. The realization of her total defeat finally settled over her, a physical weight that seemed to bow her shoulders. She looked at the chair, then at Julian, and finally at the door. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. They didn't touch her, but their presence was an ultimatum. Beatrice gathered her purse, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking a hollow, desperate rhythm on the hardwood. As she passed Julian, she paused for a fraction of a second, her lips curling into one final, impotent snarl. Julian didn't flinch. He simply stepped aside, giving her the path to the exit. He watched her go, the silence in the boardroom absolute until the elevator chimes signaled her final departure from the floor. Julian Thorne turned back to the table. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. "Now," he said, looking at the assembled board, "let's discuss the future of the legacy you tried to erase." 6 months had passed since the glass doors of the Sterling Tower closed behind Beatrice for the last time, and the world had not stopped turning. In fact, for the newly rebranded Thorne Industries, it was spinning faster than ever. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new office, watching the sunset bleed crimson and gold over the city skyline. The air in the room was different now, cleaner, stripped of the heavy, cloying perfumes Beatrice used to favor. Instead, it smelled faintly of lemon wax and the ozone of high-end servers humming behind the walls. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, feeling the weight of the watch his father had worn 30 years ago. It was a modest piece, but in this room, it carried more authority than the diamond-encrusted monstrosities Marcus Sterling used to flaunt. Julian's life was a symphony of precision now. His mornings began with data streams and ended with the quiet satisfaction of a legacy restored. The board, once a den of enablers, had been purged. Silas Vance sat as lead counsel, his sharp legal mind now dedicated to transparency rather than burying Beatrice's skeletons. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the scent of exhaust lingered in the curtains, Beatrice Sterling stared at a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. The bitter taste was a constant reminder of how far she had tumbled. Her 3-bedroom rental was smaller than her former walk-in closet, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors arguing about rent. She reached for her phone, a habit she couldn't break, hoping for a call from one of the friends she had hosted at her gala just a year ago. The screen remained dark. Her social circle had evaporated the moment Director Harrison went public with the forensic audit. She wasn't just a disgraced executive. She was a social pariah, a cautionary tale whispered over mimosas in the clubs she could no longer enter. The sound of a key fumbling in the lock made her flinch. Marcus entered, his face gaunt, the bravado that once defined him replaced by a twitchy, defensive posture. He didn't look at her. He never did anymore. He worked a graveyard shift at a logistics firm, a job Julian had technically authorized as a final, stinging act of mercy. It was a position that required Marcus to move boxes, his hands once manicured now calloused and stained with cardboard dust. "Did you get the mail?" Beatrice asked, her voice raspy from disuse. Marcus threw a stack of envelopes onto the Formica table. Most were stamped with the crimson ink of overdue notices. "It's all legal bills, Mom. Silas and his team are filing another civil suit for the 2014 dividends. They're coming for the last of the trust." Beatrice's fingers trembled as she reached for a letter. She had spent her life building a fortress of entitlement, only to find that Julian had been the one holding the deed to the land. She looked at her son, seeing the reflection of her own failure in his slumped shoulders. The rage that used to sustain her had turned into a hollow, aching weight. She had lost the company, the house, and the respect of the city, but the sharpest sting was the silence. No one was coming to save her. Back at the Thorne Legacy building, Sarah Jenkins knocked softly on Julian's door. She carried a leather-bound folder, the original 1994 patents, finally returned to their rightful place in the company's central archive. "The transition is complete, Julian," she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "The last of the Sterling name has been scrubbed from the digital architecture. We are officially Thorne again." Julian turned from the window, offering a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Sarah. You've been the anchor through all of this." "You did it," she whispered. "Your father would have been proud." Julian nodded, but as Sarah left the room, the silence of the top floor settled around him. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, the seat Beatrice had guarded with such ferocity. He had won. The stock price was at an all-time high. The technology he had developed was changing the industry, and the people who had wronged his family were living in the ruins of their own making. Yet, as he looked at the empty chair across from his desk, he felt the cost of the crusade. He had spent years in the shadows, fueled by a cold, calculated fire. Now that the fire had consumed his enemies, the room felt vast and solitary. He had sacrificed his youth and his peace of mind to become the man who could take down a lioness. He picked up a heavy silver pen and began to sign the final dissolution papers for the Sterling estate. Each stroke of the pen was a nail in the coffin of his aunt's legacy. He felt no joy, only a profound sense of closure. The justice was absolute, the karma was proportional, but as the city lights twinkled below, Julian Thorne realized that while he had reclaimed his name, he would never be the person he was before the betrayal began. He was the owner of everything he had ever wanted, sitting alone in the quiet center of a conquered kingdom.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.